Finalmente, los consultores encargados del tema 4, referente a la simplificación de la regulación y de la gestión de la transmisión, son los señores Potočnik y Chervini. El señor Alberto Potočnik es un economista con amplia experiencia en política energética, regulación y diseño de mercados. Se desempeñó como el primer director de la Agencia de la Unión Europea para la Cooperación de los Reguladores de Energía, el ACER, hasta el 2019. En 1997 se unió a la Autoridad Reguladora de Energía de Italia y en el 2000 fue nombrado CEO del operador del mercado eléctrico italiano y más tarde se unió al operador italiano del sistema de transmisión. El señor Potočnik es actualmente director ejecutivo adjunto de la Escuela de Regulación de Florencia. En el caso de Guido Chervini, él es un economista especializado en el sector energético. Es investigador del Instituto de Economía Energética y Ambiental de la Universidad de Bocconi en Milán y del Centro de Regulación de Europa, el CERRE, en Bruselas. Ha sido jefe de la División de Competencia y Mercados de la Autoridad de Electricidad y Gas de Italia. Es consultor y asesor sobre cuestiones regulatorias y de competencia en los mercados energéticos en toda Europa. Con ustedes dejo a los señores Potočnik y Chervini, quienes se encargarán de la presentación. Adelante, Alberto y Guido, por favor.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Let me share my slides and I'd like to start by thanking you and all the stakeholders, the peer reviewers, and everybody who's been involved in this process for their comments, their suggestions. It has been a very interesting project, and we're very honored to have been able to perform it. So this is the last presentation, the presentation of the final report, which is submitted a couple of weeks ago, and where we present our analysis and also our recommendation for the improvement of the regulation of the transmission system in Peru. Our approach has focused on proposing a conceptual model and framework. So the degree of detail of our proposal is consistent with what the purpose of the assignment was. This is only a first step, as we understand, of a process that will later on produce a white book, a white paper, for a more detailed assessment and more detailed recommendations on how to reform and improve the transmission system in the regulation of the transmission system in Peru. The presentation that Guido and I will deliver today is structured in 3 parts. It summarizes what we have already presented in more details in the previous meetings. So in the first part, we will look at the objectives to be pursued and the variable of choice to be used when it comes to the regulation of the transmission sector in general. Then we will look at how the current regulatory framework for the regulation of transmission in Peru, and then we will look at the issues which are raised by the current arrangement, and then how we can improve these arrangements and provide our recommendations. So let me start immediately with the first part of the presentation. The objectives to be pursued and the variable of choices to be used by the regulators and by the policymakers when it comes to regulating the transmission sector in a jurisdiction. Here we've looked at 3 areas. First is effective planning. Second one is minimization of investment costs. And then once you have the assets on the ground, you have plan them, build them, then how you operate them in the most efficient way. So let's start by looking at effective planning, and let's see what this requires or entails. First of all, obviously, the planner should have the technical capability to plan, and these capabilities are different, for example, when it comes to distribution systems, sub-transmission systems, or transmission system, depending on the voltage level mainly. if you plan a system, you need to be able to forecast demand and generation. So the planner should have an ability to come up with an effective forecast of these of the development in demand and supply of electricity, so that they know how to plan and plan the grid. And in particular, and in fact, usually the development of the grid takes a lot longer than the development of the resources to be connected to the grid. So it is good that it is necessary, I would say, that and has a good understanding and ability to forecast development in generation and demand. And then you have to have a unified view of the entire network. The electricity network is one where there are clearly synergies, economies of scale, and therefore duplication should be avoided by having a unified vision. We've seen in the case of Peru some inefficiencies, and I will refer to them later on, due to the fact that at the moment there may not be as a unified vision as possible. So what are the challenges that we are facing in Peru, or that we have identified in Peru? As I mentioned, coordination among different planners, different levels of planning for different types of infrastructures. And then we have seen also the lack of interest sometimes of sub-transmission concession holders in participating in the planning process in an effective way. So that about planning. Let's see minimization of investment cost. We have seen, I mean, one of the aspects which obviously is critical here is the way in which you procure the network component and the engineering services, because at the end of the day, this is what produce the cost of infrastructure, and therefore having effective procurement procedure is particularly important. And then the cost of capital. These are the energy sector is an infrastructure sector, so a capital intensive, and the cost of capital is clearly one of the main component of the cost of this sector. Here as we will see in details, in Peru we have two models which are applied in different parts of the network. We have competition for the market, so the use of tenders on the one hand, and regulation on the other. And this sometimes does not produce the most efficient outcome, but as I said, I will go in more details in just a moment. And we've also seen that probably one of the weak links in the implementation of investment of transmission planning. So when it comes to investment, the weak link is the ability of government-owned or publicly owned distribution company to implement sub-transmission investment, and we will come to more detail to that. Finally, when it comes to operating the system, one aspect which is particularly important is the system operator having full control of the assets, and then also to have an optimal maintenance strategy. And here, one aspect that I will refer to later on is that maintenance can be outsourced, so it can be carried out by companies which are specialized in this, and that might solve the problem of ownership fragmentation when it comes to operation of the assets. So I will stop for the moment here. Guido will now cover the next slide, and then I'll come back when it comes to looking at the current situation in Peru. Guido?
Thank you, Alberto. Could you please move to the next one?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay. What we looked at to start with was the set of variables that define the organizational model of transmission activities. And we identified the variables that I will briefly present now, and as a sort of an introduction to the results that we will be presenting later. So the first variable of choice, the first object of decision, if you like, is the perimeter of the transmission, sub-transmission, and the distribution network. Here, the relevant question is how do we treat sub-transmission in particular? Do we treat it like transmission, or do we treat it like distribution as far as the regulatory framework, ownership, and organization is concerned? The options that you can have in this area are basically two. The first one is treating sub-transmission like transmission, and the other one is treating sub-transmission like distribution. Here, the drivers of choice, I mean, what should drive the decision between the two approaches is the relative importance of coordination and the nature of the activities. Since it appears, at least from the international experience, since sub-transmission entails the same kind of use of the territory, also the same, Alberto, sorry, you are, okay, same use, same occupation of the space, same technology and maintenance as distribution to a large extent, there is a tendency at the international level to treat sub-transmission as an extension or part of distribution more than transmission. But as we will discuss later, Peru seems to have specific issues with distribution companies that make it relevant also the other option, i.e. the one of treating sub-transmission as transmission, basically. But we will discuss this later. The second variable of choice is the industry structure. In particular, the relevant decision here is between the ISO model and the TSO model. The ISO model is the one in which the system operator of the network doesn't own the network. The transmission system operator model is the one in which the system operator also is the owner of the network. Another series of options relates to how to segregate the transmission activities, including system operations, from the other activities, generation, distribution, retail in particular. And there, the relevant decision is what kind of separation to enforce. Milder separations based on legal, functional unbundling, or stronger separation based on ownership segregation. Here, again, I don't want to anticipate the results of the study, but the international experience suggests that there is no clear superior model between ISO and TSO. We envisaged, but it's a second order problem, some problems related to the development of flexibility services in the future that might be related to having a transmission system operator rather than an independent system operator. With a transmission system operator, you might expect a bit of bias in favor of investing in transmission assets compared to other solutions, maybe more modern, more based on digital technologies, et cetera, to ensure security of supply, system security at minimum cost. As I mentioned, these are really second order differences. And Peru has already chosen a model that is to a large extent independent system operator. It's a model that proves to be workable and effective in many countries. So we don't see anything particular to change in that. However, where the problems may be is with the independence between either the system operator or the transmission system operator, depending on the model, and the other activities, in particular generation and retail. In that respect, that was not an area covered by our thematic line, because it was covered by the other thematic line, the one on institutional setting. We just limit ourselves to sort of pointing out that independence is crucial for system operator, transmission system operator. The third variable of choice is the way you organize supply, say, procurement of transmission services. Here, the Peru model is based on auctions to select transmission operators and at the same time set the allowed revenues of the transmission operator as a byproduct of the auction. The alternative model is based on regulation It's the one used in most countries, actually. What are the drivers of choice? How do we decide? Well, first of all, one has to compare the merits of competition versus regulation. If competition is workable, it can strike very good deals for the consumers and the regulators. And so that sort of pushes in favor of auctions, or a solution based on auctions, like the one Peru is implementing now. If there is the feeling that competition is not effective, regulation might be reasonably effective. The second driver for the choice between auctions and regulation is the set of issues that result as a byproduct of the model that you choose. If you choose auctions, auctions can be won by different parties, and you might end up with a transmission network that is fragmented in ownership. Too much fragmentation may create coordination issues, but that's not a big problem at the transmission level, where you don't have that many assets, and also that you have a native coordination function exercised by the system operator. It might be more of a problem if you try to apply the same logic of auctions at the subtransmission level, for example. The next big decision to take is what is the logic that drives network development decisions. Here, the two possible approaches are planification versus merchant models. What we learn from this international experience is that planning remains indispensable. In countries where you have merchant lines coexisting with the planning networks, the interaction between the two can be not easy for the regulator in particular, and for the system operator, in particular when it comes to setting the volume of transmission rights that are allocated to merchant investments. However, also the international experience tells us that merchant investments can be sensible in situations of a high risk. And in this respect, for example, in Europe, merchant investments are sometimes, the merchant approach is sometimes used to regulate cross-border, to plan and implement cross-border interconnections. So in a sense, the balance between planning and merchant changes depending on the risk and depending on how difficult or how easy it is to determine a set of transmission rights that corresponds to the asset. Finally, the tariff structure. In another thematic line, let me first mention the two options. So the two options are, you can use transmission tariffs also not only to recover costs, but also to manage congestions, i.e. to send to the market participants signals as to the level of utilization of the network. Or you can use another tool to manage congestions. And in another area of the research, it is proposed to use locational electricity pricing. And in this case, transmission tariffs are left with a relatively easy job, that is covering costs. So here, what is the driver of the decision? In a sense, there is no driver because there is consensus that managing congestion through locational price differentiation is the best way to do. Is the best way to go. But if that was not impossible, one could think of introducing locational elements of time-based elements also on transmission tariffs. However, we defer to the authors of the other report who recommend congestion management via locational prices. So our proposals on the tariff structure are all based on the assumption that locational prices will be used to manage congestions. Alberto, thank you. You can take control.
Thank you very much, Guido. And I think we move on. Yeah, we move on. If you can hear me still, and we now look at the regulatory framework and the organization of transmission activities in Peru. Let's start with the institutions. It's a fairly typical setting, which we find in most countries. There is the government, there is an independent regulator, and there is the independent system operator, the ministry, OCITERMIN, and COES. As we said, this is fairly standard, so we don't have much to say about the design here. There is an issue about the effective independence of the system operator, but as Peter mentioned, we refer to thematic line 1 on the institutional setting to provide any recommendation about the independence of the system operator. Let's now look briefly at how the regulatory framework for the different activities, especially when it comes to planning, when it comes to implementation of what it is planned, and in setting the allowed revenues. And in Peru, there are different systems for the different types of networks, for transmission, for subtransmission, and for unplanned network systems, the redes no planificadas. So for transmission, the planning is done centrally by the system operator. The implementation is actually done through competitive tenders, unless there is an operator that comes up and proposes to build what has been planned, in which case the remuneration, the allowed revenues, will be set through regulation, while in general, if tenders are used, then the outcome of the tenders, the bid of the successful tender, will set the remuneration, the allowed revenue for the new investment. For subtransmission, it is somehow the reverse. The concession holder will be, at least in theory, responsible for planning. We'll see that this doesn't really work all the time as it should. And as the primary approach is the implementation is actually assigned by the regulator typically to the local operator. And it is only when the local operator refuses to or is unable to develop the infrastructure, then competitive tenders are actually used. And here again, if the default approach is used, then it will be regulated allowed revenues based on standard costing. If instead tenders are used, then the bid of the successful tender will determine the allowed revenues. When it comes to the unplanned network system, it is planned by the private developers, it is implemented by the private developer, and then being private infrastructure, there would be an agreement between the owner or the operator and the user, somebody wanting to use this infrastructure. In case of dispute, then the regulator will step in and will sort the dispute out. Let's see what this setting has produced. If you look at transmission, we see that in the end, despite the fact that there is each individual new pieces of infrastructure is tendered out, this has not resulted in significant fragmentation of the ownership of transmission assets in Peru. We see that the two main transmission operators control most of the infrastructure. And also, if we see the new pieces of infrastructure, the new investment that have been carried out over the last 15 years, we noted that only 2 of these new investments have been implemented or been assigned to companies which are not part of the 2 largest groups. So the system, while in theory open to fragmentation, to resulting in a fragmented ownership structure, has not actually delivered it. And we see that it seems to be working quite well. If we look at sub-transmission level, the situation is where, as I remember, it's the reverse. As the default system, it is assigned the responsibility for the development of the infrastructure is assigned through regulation by the regulator. We see again that there is no major fragmentation except for demand area 12. Largest part of the infrastructure actually owned by the first and second and third operators, and most of these operators are actually distribution companies, local distribution companies. So again, in both cases, for transmission and sub-transmission, the current system has not resulted in major problems when it comes to ownership structure, but we will see that there are issues, different issues when it comes to coordination and the speed of implementation. So this is what I will turn to now, looking at the issue with the different aspects for the regulation of transmission and subtransmission. And I'll start with subtransmission, which seems to be probably one of the most critical aspects. And let me start by looking at the planning of subtransmission. And as I mentioned already, we've noticed some poor commitment and some slow response of some subtransmission concession holders when it comes to the planning process. This results in the regulator ended up acting not as a regulator, but more as a planner, to having an active role in subtransmission planning, which is clearly beyond the role of a regulator, which should mainly oversee the process and possibly approve it. And also, we believe that there is some improvement could be made in the coordination between transmission and subtransmission planning. At the moment, this seems to be mostly done through ITC, which is transmission connection infrastructure planning. Obviously, this is still need to be tested. When it comes to the implementation of what it is planned, it seems that tendering is not the most suitable system, because it has not necessarily, but it could end up with some fragmentation. And it seems that, as I mentioned, state-owned or government-owned distribution companies seems to be reluctant to participate in the process. And sometimes they don't even produce auctionable specifications for the tenders to run. So these are two aspects which, when it comes to implementation, what it is planned, need to address. Now, we have looked at three possible options. We have our preference. I'll come to that in a moment. I think Guido has already mentioned it. Three options on how to improve the operation, the planning, and the implementation of subtransmission. One option is actually to integrate subtransmission with distribution. So to assign the responsibility for subtransmission clearly to a distribution company, when more than one distribution company operate in the same demand area. Then identify a reference distributor who would be responsible for planning and implementing transmission assets in the demand area. Can you still hear me? Because I hear some.
Por favor, pueden cerrar sus micrófonos el resto de.
Okay, well, I guess I continue.
Gracias.
Now, if there are issues regarding the technical capability of distribution companies, and we believe that this may be the case, then the system operator could provide technical assistance for a fee. So there is still a role for the system operator to support the process, but the responsibility should be clearly in the hand of the distribution companies, and the regulator should act as a regulator. So the regulator should be supervising the process and should be possibly endorsing, endorsing the outcome. The implementation responsibility, as I mentioned, should be in the hand of the distributor or the referent distributors. We see in this case there will be no changes in the planning or implementation of transmission, because, as I said, we're trying to merge the subtransmission segment with distribution. And however, this means that we need to look carefully at the capability and at the performance of the distribution companies, because they will be in charge with also developing subtransmission. This is one option, and this I can already disclose. This is our preferred option, having looked at also the functional role of subtransmission, which in Peru seems to be more similar to distribution than to transmission. So it would make sense also from an operational point of view to merge subtransmission and distribution when it comes to organization, regulation, and the operation. Now, we could also look at two other options. One is to have for subtransmission the same model as transmission, which means the use of tender. So there will be the planning responsibility will be with the system operator, with the regulator supervising it. There will be auction, as I mentioned, as it currently happens with transmission. There won't be much changes in terms of transmission planning and implementation, because at the end of the day, they will remain based on auction. And when it comes to the distribution companies, again, there won't be much changes because they will not be involved in this at all. And the third one, which is probably the most revolutionary one, even though it may make sense, but it would affect the planning and operation of transmission, which at the moment seems to be working well. So usually if something seems to have a problem, it's better not to touch it. The third option is basically to integrate a transmission system operation and subtransmission system operator. So a vertical integration between transmission and subtransmission, that would mean creating local monopolies or regional monopoly for transmission. So it would mean changing the way in which transmission planning and implementation is run at the moment. It will become a monopoly in the operation in each geographical area. The planning responsibility will stay on the TSO with the regulator overseeing it. The implementation would not be by auctions. The assignment of the responsibility for implementing what is planned would not be by auction, will be a regulated business. And so it will, as I said, change quite significantly the way in which the transmission system will be operated. On the other hand, there will be no changes in the distribution, in the way in which distributors operate at the moment. As I mentioned, our preference is on option one, and it's consistent with both the technical characteristics and also with the functional role of subtransmission and distribution. Yes, indeed, it will require a more active role of the distribution companies, but this is coming anyway, because as I think it emerged quite clearly from thematic line 3, it's a new world for transmission, for distribution companies, where they will have to manage decentralized resources and a greater penetration of renewables. So they will need to change anyway. Obviously, the problems that we're facing at the moment with, in the case of public-owned distribution company, would have to be solved, because obviously they will become some of the major players in this respect. So when it comes to our recommendation, we recommend that the responsibility for planning is actually moved to a reference distributor. The system operator can provide technical support for a fee. The process is open, transparent, and involves all stakeholders, and the role of the regulator is the role of the regulator. So it will not be involved in the planning, but rather will be checking, endorsing, and positively approving. When it comes to the implementation, again, we foresee assigning the implementation to the reference distributor, if it's more than one, or the distributor operating in a demand area. I think consideration should be given to introduce incentive regulations so that the development of new infrastructure is done on time and properly, and we think that the tendering system should be discontinued. If these recommendations were implemented, we believe that they will result in more effective subtransmission planning and implementation, and also the synergies between subtransmission and distribution could be exploited, and also we will prevent network fragmentation. So this is when it relates to subtransmission. Now we move to transmission. As I said, we believe that the current system works quite well. There are only a few aspects that needs probably to be improved. First is the coordination between the different planning, as I mentioned beforehand, transmission planning, planning of assets under the former contractor's lay, rural electrification planning, and subtransmission planning. They seems at the moment not fully coordinating, and in fact, when it comes to transmission, subtransmission planning coordination, it seems to be just through the ITC infrastructure planning. And then it seems that some improvement in the information which is used in the planning could be achieved, especially in connection with, related to new connection requests, so that the planning is actually performed, also taking into account this, and you avoid, some lines to be planned without considering new demand for connection that might indicate a different planning solution. When it comes to implementation, as I mentioned before, the current system based on auction seems to be effective. Now there seems to be some issues regarding a bit of gaming when it comes to reinforcement, because there is some the operator which is responsible for reinforcement may first claim that it is not interested, then produce non-auctionable design, and then or discourage other players to come in, or other player may be discouraged to come in by the fact that the infrastructure to be reinforced is very much cohabitant in the same, for example, substation with existing assets, and therefore, in the end, the owner of the assets to be reinforced will have a negotiation with the regulator trying to achieve better solutions. So let's see what we can recommend to try to improve the situation. I think we need to have a structured process for coordination of transmission planning, subtransmission planning, planning of assets under the former contract lay and rural electrification plan. And we also need to integrate large connections in the transmission planning. When it comes to reinforcement, we think we believe that we need to discontinue the tendering system for reinforcement, and rather implement a regulated model, possibly with incentive features, so that the owner of the assets to be reinforced will be the one that has to act, and it would be incentivized for that. In both cases, I think we will have a more efficient network development and a timely implementation of reinforcement. One other aspect where we've seen issues is the publicly owned distribution companies. Already mentioned them several times. They seem to have limited access to long-term financing. Their public ownership structure seems to prevent them somehow to access the financial markets. There we were not sure exactly what the problem is, because at one point the fact that they could contribute to the public sector debt in Peru was mentioned, but then we believe that the debt we're talking about in distribution companies is probably a very minor part of the Peru national debt. So we're not sure what the problem is. For sure, they have problems in accessing the financial market. They're also subject to the general cost-benefit analysis for the use of public funding, which seems to be quite cumbersome and delay, for sure, the implementation of investment. And finally, in some cases, they have no technical competencies, or they have limited technical competencies when it comes to sub-transmission infrastructure. So all of this has resulted in their sort of underperformance with respect to the implementation of sub-transmission planning. Well, then we need, our recommendation looks at the three different aspects that I've just highlighted. So we recommend that a different way of financing investment from a publicly owned distribution company is identified, which is compatible with Peru's national accounts and national debt. We believe that once the investment has been approved in the planning for the energy sector, it should also deem to be approved with respect to the procedures and the test and the criteria for public sector investment. So there is no point in performing a cost-benefit analysis again once it has been performed at level of planning. This should also streamline the process of funding in the public sector. And then we need to provide incentives to the state-owned, publicly owned distribution company. It's very difficult to provide the same incentives that incentive-based regulations usually provides, which is on the owner of the assets, because here the owner is the government. So the way of providing incentive is to have some performance-based management compensation. So the management of the company would be compensated for efficient development of the infrastructure. If all of this is done, then distributors will have the correct incentives and also the adequate resources to invest in sub-transmission. When it comes to unplanned network systems, which is a fairly, it's a fairly peculiar aspect of the system in Peru, because usually in other systems you have connections, but most of the transmission, sub-transmission systems are actually publicly owned or part of the public network. Here we've seen problems with third-party access, with a lot of disputes, and we also seeing that the planning by the private developer not taking into account the future needs or the future opportunities of these infrastructure. And so we believe that here also some revision is necessary. And here we're fairly radical, because what we say is that we would recommend that the regime of redes no planificadas, so unplanned network system, is limited to those portions of the grid, those infrastructure, which are unlikely to be shared in the future by other market participants. So which are really almost radial connections. For the rest, we think that these networks should be integrated into sub-transmission, should be planned with the sub-transmission, should be developed as part of the sub-transmissions, should be operated as part of the sub-transmissions. The parties which at the moment are developing these unplanned systems, so the ones that are seeking connection and they're building their own infrastructure for connection, should be granted access to the new planned infrastructure, basically as if they were developing their own infrastructure. But then the sub-transmission concession holder will be free to size and to plan the new infrastructure, also taking into account future developments, future operators, future market participants, which may come and request connection in the future. So the party seeking connect, or the party which at the moment would propose to develop an unplanned network system would have the same possibilities, would have the same right to the same capacity, but the capacity of the infrastructure may be larger to take into account future developments, and then we will try to avoid some of the problems that we've seen at the moment. We were referred to a piece of infrastructure that was developed, and then a new connection came in, and then the rated capacity of that infrastructure had to be reduced because to take into account the new connection. So the advantages would be more efficient network development, and also try to reduce the dispute between the owner and those parties seeking access. We still have two topics to go through, but it's tariff and interconnectors, and I will now pass again the screen back to Guido to cover these two topics.
The first one is that generators bear the risk that tariff revenues result lower than the transmission revenues that have to be paid to transmission owners. This is not justified because generators don't have any control on transmission tariff and transmission revenues. So we recommend that this feature be modified, and that this risk is basically moved to consumers. So tariffs should be adjusted so that maybe the following year transmission owners recover everything they have to recover, or if they got paid too much, they give it back. The second flaw that we identified relates to the structure of the tariff. We found that transmission charges on generators, just a part of those charges, the part covering the cost of SCT and SST assets, are based on energy injections. This means that those tariffs become variable costs for the generators, and once bid-based dispatch of generation capacity is implemented, the effect of this additional part of the variable cost of generation that is produced by the transmission tariffs can be distorted. So you might end up dispatching a generator while you should be dispatching another one, because the transmission charge on one is lower than the one on the other. Having said that, those are relatively easy things to fix. Alberto, could you please change? Okay, on the broader topic of the transmission tariff design. What we did is recognize that in other parts of the report, locational prices were recommended as the best way to address transmission capacity allocation or congestion management. And once you accept that principle, you basically relieve transmission tariffs from one important task, the task of signaling scarcity of transmission capacity. At that point, what you have to do is just design a transmission system that is as little distortive as possible. And we proposed one of such transmission tariff arrangements based on the following features. Shallow connection charges, i.e. generators pay for the cost of connecting to the transmission network as a connection, but they do not pay for network reinforcements that are required to connect them. On the other hand, you use locational electricity prices, nodal, as recommended in the other thematic line, to allocate capacity and manage congestions. Then you're left with some money to recover from consumers to cover transmission costs, and we recommend precisely that that money be covered with a flat tariff on all consumers. This is not the only possible way. There is no guidance from economic theory on the optimal structure of transmission tariffs on consumers, or at least the guidance that you get is so extreme, it's called peak load pricing, that is in practice not implementable. The one we propose is one of many, several at least, transmission models that is fair enough with respect to what each customer is charged. And the other features of the transmission tarification model, the one of locational prices, ensures that minimum redispatch costs are paid or be paid in Peru. And also the generators have hedging possibilities against the risk that transmission becomes scarce. So that's on transmission tariffs. Alberto, can we move to the remaining topic? We finally studied cross-border interconnection, and we first learned that multiple studies suggest that cross-border interconnectors, additional cross-border interconnectors, would deliver benefits to Peru. However, we also noticed that the market fundamentals, the structure of the industry, and the organization of wholesale markets in Peru and in neighboring countries are still far from being settled. I mean, they change. So that means that on the one hand, it is necessary to regularly monitor and assess the opportunity to increase cross-border capacity. And on the other hand, that means that when choosing the trading arrangements to decide how that capacity is used, one has to look on a case-by-case basis. So you cannot just design a model. And if we can move to the recommendations that are brought to a large extent on this line, what we recommend is that, first of all, the benefits and costs of increasing interconnection capacity be monitored on a regular basis by the system operator and by the regulator through cost-benefit analysis. Then on the organization of the use of cross-border transmission capacity, we are quite open in that we understand that the precise organizational model depends on two important features of the neighboring markets: the degree of competition and the way and the trading arrangements, the wholesale market design. So based on those two features, one can implement different organizational models, ranging from very simple models in which you allocate capacity, possibly you build it merchant, and then the owner of this capacity can use it the way he wants. So he has to go to the other country, purchase the electricity, and make it such that that electricity crosses the borders and reaches Peru, or vice versa. An extreme, at the opposite extreme, you have very, very structured mechanisms to use cross-border capacity, like the one implemented in Europe, in which, thanks to a lot of coordination between not only system operators, but also spot markets at both sides of the interconnectors, basically the transmission capacity across the borders is allocated efficiently on a continuous basis, precisely as the domestic capacity. I think that ends what I had to say on cross-border, Alberto. So if you want to wrap up or...
So this completes the presentation of our main recommendations. The report obviously has more, but obviously in an hour we could not cover all of it. I think at the end I just want to repeat our thanks to to you, Eduardo, to Mrs. Franco, to all stakeholders who have provided comments, and in particular to the three peer reviewers, Professor Campton, Professor Paesariaga, and Professor Baglie, for their constructive remarks, which has helped us a lot, not only in correcting some mistakes that we had, but also in improving our thinking and our assessment. So I think that's it. And thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Muchas gracias, Alberto y Guido, por la presentación. Antes de terminar, quisiera también reconocer y agradecer por su invalorable colaboración y contribución a los profesores Ignacio Pérez Arriaga y Carlos Valle de la Universidad Pontificia Comillas de Madrid, y al profesor Peter Crampton de la Universidad de Maryland en USA y de la Universidad de Colonia en Alemania. Estos especialistas son reconocidos expertos en el sector energético en Europa, Estados Unidos y América Latina. Los doctores Pérez Arriaga, Valle y Crampton han participado como revisores pares de los informes preparados por los consultores. Muchísimas gracias, Ignacio, Carlos y Peter, por sus aportes. Y muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia. Buenos días.
Damas y caballeros, hemos concluido con la presentación de los informes finales del marco conceptual de modernización del sector eléctrico. Lo que corresponde ahora es hacer extensiva la invitación al señor Ministro de Energía y Minas, Jaime Gálvez Delgado, para que nos brinde sus palabras de clausura del presente evento.
Señores comisionados de la Comisión Multisectorial para la Reforma del Subsector Electricidad, señora representante del Banco Mundial, amigos todos. Es grato dirigirme a ustedes en representación del Ministerio de Energía y Minas al culminar exitosamente este evento, en el cual se han presentado los informes finales del marco conceptual sobre los cuales se desarrollará el libro blanco del subsector electricidad. El contexto actual de la pandemia nos ha demostrado la importancia de contar con un sistema eléctrico seguro, confiable y eficiente, pues permite a los ciudadanos realizar sus actividades esenciales, reactivar la economía, garantizar el acceso a la educación en los hogares, el desarrollo del trabajo remoto y permitir que los sistemas de salud operen en forma ininterrumpida. Una vez culminada esta etapa inicial, la Comisión ha trabajado en el desarrollo de los alcances de los términos de referencia para la elaboración del libro blanco del subsector electricidad. Dicho documento ha permitido definir los 4 ejes temáticos sobre los cuales se basará la modernización del sector eléctrico. Primero, el fortalecimiento del marco institucional. Luego, la transformación del mercado mayorista. En tercer lugar, la innovación en distribución y comercialización. Y por último, la mejora de la regulación y gestión de la transmisión. La primera etapa ha consistido en la elaboración de los marcos conceptuales que servirán de guía para el desarrollo de cada uno de los ejes temáticos. Es decir, ya tenemos ahora el marco conceptual necesario para avanzar con la reforma integral del sector eléctrico. Esta reforma nos permitirá enfrentar los retos y desafíos del siglo XXI, como el ingreso de las redes inteligentes, la generación distribuida, la electromovilidad, entre otros, que forman parte de la transición energética hacia un modelo que promueva la descarbonización de la economía, alineado a los compromisos internacionales asumidos por el país en la lucha contra el cambio climático, garantizándose así el buen cuidado del medio ambiente. Durante el trabajo de la Comisión nos ha quedado claro que, si bien es cierto le corresponde al Estado fijar las reglas del mercado, es fundamental escuchar la opinión de todos los actores implicados. Por ello, en la elaboración de los informes se ha buscado la pluralidad de opiniones que enriquezcan el análisis y permitan contar con una propuesta integral. Quiero culminar haciendo extensivo mi reconocimiento y agradecimiento al Viceministerio de Electricidad, a la Dirección General de Electricidad, a los INERMIN, al Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas y también a todo el sector privado que ha participado en el desarrollo de esta primera etapa. Asimismo, quiero agradecer el valioso apoyo brindado por el Banco Mundial en este proceso y a las diferentes instituciones que nos han acompañado en esta etapa y han contribuido a mejorar los informes finales que hoy tenemos a disposición de todos. Esperamos seguir contando con su apoyo en la siguiente etapa de la elaboración del libro blanco, que nos permitirá dar un salto cualitativo y cuantitativo en la modernización del sector eléctrico peruano. Muchas gracias.
Damas y caballeros, han sido las palabras de clausura por parte del señor Ministro de Energía y Minas, y con esto cerramos el presente webinar, no sin antes agradecer a ustedes por su interés y presencia. Que tengan todos ustedes muy buenas tardes.